All right, so I think it's okay to go ahead and get started here and start off with a little introduction. I first off want to say thanks everybody for joining. We think this is a very important topic, and we're actually extremely lucky to have a phenomenal panel here to kind of discuss a couple of things we've been thinking a lot about lately. But I'll start off with a brief introduction. My name is Benjamin Cox. I'm a director here at H2O.ai. I help the team with some responsible AI research, thought leadership, and writing, and kind of formulating our thoughts on what we think about the space. And for those who've been with us for some time, you know that our company has been built on the back of really thinking this is a super, super important area, and that as we build and scale out machine learning universally, that doing so with a very progressive mind of how can we be more transparent, how can we be more auditable, how can we be more white box from beginning to end. We've spent a lot of time kind of writing and thinking about this. So I really don't want to use up much more time. I want to really let the panelists kind of introduce themselves, because I think they have a breadth and wealth of experience here that can, really shine some light on some areas we're really looking at a lot these days. So with that, I think we can go around the horn. Maybe Edward, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. My name is Edward Santow. I'm responsible for leading an AI and human rights initiative at the University of Technology here in Sydney. So I'm a professor at that university. Up until 3 months ago, I was Australia's Human Rights Commissioner and led a major project on the human rights implications of artificial intelligence.
Awesome. How about Wan Sie?
Thanks, Benjamin. Hi, I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm Wan Sie from IMDA. IMDA stands for the Infocom Media Development Authority of Singapore. And essentially, my work focuses very much on how do we encourage more responsible deployment of AI. We look at both guidance that the government can give, very detailed guidance, as well as potentially regulations that we need to introduce. The other area of my work is to support companies in using data in a trustworthy manner. So in that case, in that area, very much the focus is on how do we facilitate a lot more trusted data sharing, for example. So today I'm happy to talk about what Singapore is doing in this area in terms of AI governance. Thank you.
Awesome. Dan?
Sure. Thanks, Benjamin. I'm Daniel Jermyn. I'm the Chief Decision Scientist at Commonwealth Bank, the largest bank in Australia. I've been here around 4 years. I look after teams of very talented people doing all things science in the application of banking and financial well-being. So experimental science, behavioral economics, and obviously AI, data science, machine learning play a huge part in what we do, and very interested and active in the fields of responsible deployment of those things. So keen to get into it.
And Aurelie?
Hi everyone, same here. Absolute pleasure to be part of this panel. My name is Aurelie Jacquet. I'm the chair of the Standards Committee that's representing Australia at the International Standard on AI. We have a funny number, GTC1 SC42, for those that like numbers. And I'm also the co-chair for the first independent and global certification initiative for the certification of AI systems that's led by the Responsible AI Institute in conjunction with the World Economic Forum. As I say, my focus is very much on standards, so I'm also working with the IEEE as an expert. And I'm together with Edward Santow, we're also on the New South Wales AI Advisory Committee.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's funny. This happens a lot in the States too, where we all kind of find ourselves on similar panels or organizations kind of working to push things forward. I think it would be really useful if we could kind of go around the horn again and say, so as this area started, obviously explainable, interpretable, responsible AI all kind of took various adoption. I'd love to hear from the group, sort of how you define responsible or fair AI, and sort of how do you think about organizations starting to implement it, or where would you begin, right? Very high level, top of the house question.
I can start off if it'd be helpful again. when I was Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, we did this really extensive public consultation, as well as with experts, but particularly focused on the public, asking them what they want from technology, what will give them the sort of technology-driven future that they want and they need, not the one that we all fear. And it really boiled down to three key things that were at the heart of responsible technology. They want technology to be fair, they want it to be accurate, and they want it to be accountable. And those three principles of fairness, accuracy, and accountability, interestingly, are principles at the heart of every liberal democracy. So they're not principles that relate only to technology, but essentially what people were saying to us was that if you're going to use new technology like AI to make really significant decisions that will affect me because, you know, it's a home loan decision or a decision about recruitment, about a job I might get, or whatever it happens to be, we don't mind whether it's a decision that is kind of using the most sophisticated form of AI or an abacus or something in between, but it should be fair, accurate, and accountable. And so that for me is the kind of lodestar.
Yeah, I like Ed's answer a lot there. I mean, I think one of the ways in which this is often framed is in terms of ethics. And the thing about that is that ethics is many thousands-year-old sort of school of philosophy, and I don't think there's a programmatic way to solve for it yet. And yes, when we're talking about AI and machine learning, a lot of the time we're conflating that with automation, and I think it would be a grave mistake to consider humans as not being critically important in the role of deploying this technology really fairly and transparently, as Ed says. I think the things that comes out to me is, are you able to explain the results that you're getting? Are you able to explain the methods that you're using? Can you be clear about those things? And can you be sure that you're not introducing unfair or unexpected discrimination into the process? These are the key kind of checkpoints for us as we think about responsibly deploying this technology for our customers.
I might add to that. So as mentioned, the key incidents that comes from AI that you see always on the first page, it's either because it's poor design, sometimes negligent, or it's just malicious use. So noting that from my perspective and the work we're focusing is really on making sure, one, you're in control of your tools, and AI in that case, and you can explain how you're in control of this tool. And so it's really very much focused on risk management and governance. So that's the key pieces. And what's responsible AI? For me, it's like definitely go to quality. AI that's got the right quality and that can be embedded in society and fit for purpose. So again, all the topic we mentioned is it needs to be fit for use in society.
Yeah, I actually agree with Edward, Dan, and Aurelie. I think very much it is about fairness, transparency, and being able to explain what's happening. But most importantly, it has to be human-centric. You need to make sure that the AI that you're implementing it's not going to be dangerous. It's not going to be cause any harm to humans. I think that's also an important aspect of responsible AI. I think when we think about it, we organize it into maybe 4 buckets. One is knowing what it does. That's the explainability aspect of it. Making sure that it's safe and it's consistent, it's robust. That's the safety aspect of it. And then making sure that it's fair, right? That there's no bias introduced in the algorithm because of data and so on. And then finally being accountable to what you're doing and the human centricity aspect of it. So that's how we organized our thinking around what are the measures that we have to look into when we talk about responsible AI.
Wow. I mean, I love these answers, and there's a lot of different pieces to kind of drill down on, but let me kind of continue the thought and say, so this can go a couple different directions, and I want to try to be cognizant of, levels of technicality that the audience might have, but we say, it needs to be fair, right? And I think there's a lot of takes on, I think there's a great UT presentation on 23 definitions of fair, but let's use, discrimination as the, the lodestar for it, right? And say, okay, when you start to think about saying, let's prevent AI from perpetuating or bringing in or causing discrimination or unfair treatment or disparate treatment, How do you start to think about doing that? Because I know we've written on it from a place of technical tools, processes in orgs, and people and organizational structures that might, kind of prevent that. But I'm curious to hear the panel's thoughts on where do you put weighting and how do you start to think about preventing bias from getting introduced algorithmically?
On condition that I'm not always the first one to answer the question, I'm happy to have another swing at this one. I'll be really brief, but we had this really interesting experiment that we ran with CSIRO, so Australia's leading kind of scientific research body as part of the government, their Data 61 unit, and a number of other partners, where we were trying to better diagnose and treat the problem of unfairness and specifically discrimination in a very realistic setting. And one of the difficulties was, this is a bit of a caricature here, but one of the difficulties was that the data scientists ended up saying to people like me, and my background is as a lawyer, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Just give us a number. If you're telling us that there have to be 50% female customers and 50% male customers, we can make that happen. If you're telling us that it's 60% female customers and 40% male customers, we can make that happen too. But just give us the number. And the difficulty with that, I totally get that, by the way. I'm very sympathetic to that worldview. The difficulty is that it doesn't lean into an accurate understanding of what discrimination means. It's not, my 4-year-old will say, that's unfair if you take away, a chocolate from him, right? But that doesn't have a legal meaning. Discrimination has a very specific legal meaning. It's not like saying, I just don't like it. That's what my 4-year-old means when he says unfair. It means something very, very specific. There's a vast body of law that sets out what the contours of discriminatory behaviour is. And there are situations where you could give 70, 80% of your products to men and not women, and it still not be unlawful. So really it's a question of, it's a mixture of art and science to get to the bottom of whether some algorithmic decision-making process is throwing up discriminatory results. What the arithmetic part of it can do really, really well is that it can throw up red flags. And so if you are giving, better service through that algorithmic process to men over women at a 60-40 rate, well, then chances are you are kind of, you've got a problem in discrimination law. But you need to tease that apart. You need to really interrogate that. And that's where the kind of art or the law bit comes in. And sadly, I would say that there's not a simple kind of automation to that analysis.
And picking up on this, I'll quote maybe another professor, Sandra Rocha. She explained that pretty much from a discrimination law perspective, the aim of the law was generally to regulate people, less so. It was trickier to do so with algorithm, because effectively, generally, when you feel discriminated against, you would raise a complaint, and that would be the process to challenge the decision that was made. Now, the interesting piece with the algorithm is you don't know, it's not that discrimination is not visible because you do not know what's happened in the background. So you cannot make that complaint. You don't have that feeling of what's happened. And really, that's why the testing now, the whole piece becomes about the testing of the algorithm. And effectively, as the techniques develop, we see that some techniques are not appropriate because effectively, even if they seem to comply with the general principle, it doesn't comply with the letter of the law, being that effectively, if you remove some of the, one example is if you remove some of the factors, like the direct discriminatory factors, this will not guarantee that your output is not discriminatory. So that's where we see, as Ed was saying, that effectively it's becoming more of an art when you see effectively the social science working a lot closely together and understanding what size of compliance requirement with the technology to actually get to that response and building on the legal requirement appropriately and the compliance requirement appropriately in the system. And I'll use the opportunity, if you're interested, we just published the standards on bias. So if you're interested in learning more on how you look at identifying bias, this is just the latest ISO publication. Here you go.
Always, I love these panels where I have to speak and I'm about to talk about law and there's a very qualified lawyer on the call, and then standards and the author of the standards is on the call too. So I'll choose my words very carefully, but I think both Ed and Aurelie are onto great points. And if I could come back to what Ed said about kind of what is lawful and what is not, I think, yeah, again, struck by how important the human element in this is. And as organizations and companies who think about progressing the boundaries of the technology, I think it's incumbent on us all to set an extremely high standard about what is right or is not. That goes well beyond what is lawful. It thinks about things like community expectation. You know, does this seem like the right sort of thing we should do? Is it having the consequences that we expected it to? I mean, the interesting thing about algorithms is they are intended to discriminate in a very strict literal sense. You know, if we were just going to treat absolutely everybody the same, we wouldn't need algorithms at all. And the question is not whether we discriminate, it's whether we do so unfairly. And that's where, as we've already alluded to, it gets very tricky. One of the practical ways that we think about that as a large organization is to make sure the team working on implementing the solutions that we're coming up with is very diverse. And that's in a number of different dimensions too. I mean, just in terms of experience more broadly within the community and with serving banking customers, I think around 10% of the people who work in my team, a very kind of technical team, started their careers on the front line serving customers in the branch or on call centers, and get a kind of much better rounded sense of, you know, what a range of customers would expect or want from a particular type of interaction that you don't get if you just have a team of kind of closeted data scientists in a room somewhere, not really thinking about the practical applications of it. So the technology allows us to check for disparity in the distributions the algorithms that we send out, but then it becomes a very human thing to have a kind of a well-governed process to get a bunch of stakeholders from a cross section to look at those outcomes and say, does that meet expectation? Is that, you know, is that result happening that way for good reasons, or has it introduced something that we hadn't intended but is having a negative consequence, and can we do something about that? And I think that's why Aurelie's point about sort of testing is incredibly important too. Things like simulation, very important for us as we think about deploying artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms out into the world in the way that we serve customers. You know, what is the likely impact of that before you push anything like? So experimentation and testing, very important in the arsenal too.
Yeah, so I actually agree with Edward, Dan, and Aurelie. I think there are various aspects to this, right? I mean, Dan talked about making sure that your development team, or at least your team within the organization that's looking at the implementation of AI has to be diverse, because some of these biases may not be introduced purposefully. I mean, it's just something that someone may not have thought about, right? So if you have a diverse team, that's important. But what we're advocating really is to make sure that you look at your data, the data that you're using to train your AI models. Make sure that it doesn't already have some embedded bias in the data, because if the data was collected through various different means in terms of like from other systems or from your past implementation or from your past records, there may be some biases introduced. So that's something that's important that the organization looked at as well, the data. But most importantly, it's also deciding, right? I mean, besides the legal requirements and besides what the regulatory compliance that's expected, is also to make sure that as an organization, what is it that you want your system to do, right? What are the attributes that you expect from the system, and the results? So I think that position has to be quite clear, and then that will be how you align your implementation and do all the subsequent testing, the data they use for modeling, and so on.
Yeah, so I think it would be good to take the other side of this question as well. And I think Dan, you kind of led into this. So these are awesome answers, but I think there's one side of this that I still think about a lot, and it's, okay, if we know certain technical and data and kind of process-driven levers we can take, I think one question that a lot of operators of companies will have is, how do you incentivize, the desire to pursue, responsible AI or things like this, right? Because I think a lot of times the question becomes, oh, well, I don't really want to like sacrifice speed. I don't really want to kind of, sacrifice innovation or anything like that. But I think one thing that companies are trying to figure out how to do is, how can they, nudge, data scientists or data creators to push for best practices, right? How can you kind of align incentives at companies to push for more responsible AI, right?
Sure. Well, maybe since I work for a large company, I'll have a crack at that one. So I think, yeah, I would say first and foremost that the pursuit of kind of ethical implementation, responsible implementations of technology is not at odds with, in fact, I think essential for kind of good commercial and customer outcomes too. I think, if you're going to introduce new technologies, new ways of working, new ways for your customers to interact with you, if you are doing that in a way that isn't compatible with their core, beliefs and expectations, then you're very quickly going to find out that you no longer have any customers. Is thing number one. I think number two, purpose-driven organizations, such as the Commonwealth Bank, where we have a team of people thinking about how do we improve financial well-being for our customers. It's very motivating for our, very talented, skilled, idealistic workforce who want to come to work and make a difference. That's I'm quite old these days, and I've worked in a few different places over the course of the last 20 years or so, where it wasn't always entirely like that. But we're getting a great amount of kind of traction and speed to market in the things that we're developing, because the team are incredibly enthusiastic about building them, because they produce great outcomes for our customers, and we feel kind of good about it. I think the third and final point that I would make for any kind of CEOs who are on the call and unwavering is think about the measurement of your outcomes, as we do. We have a very large machine learning implementation that manages the way that we communicate with our customers. It's called the Customer Engagement Engine, and it runs 400 machine learning models over 157 billion data points in real time, makes 35 million decisions every day. And as part of that implementation, we have a very robust framework of kind of control groups measuring impact, both in terms of satisfaction of customer and the way that they're feeling engaged, and conflating that with the outcomes for the business. Are we getting more customers feeling more engaged? Are they using their products well and making good kind of financial choices through that? If you can measure those outcomes, then you're on to a winner, and if you can't, then you're struggling.
I wonder if I can offer an observation as now former regulator. I think one of the difficulties in this area is that we often talk about AI ethics and not the law. And part of the problem rests with regulators like me, right? I think, if you had, let's take a bank, and at the kind of risk of embarrassing Dan, CBA rightly has a really top-notch reputation, not just in Australia, but globally, for the seriousness that it takes these issues, and that it takes its regulatory obligations very seriously. But let's take a bank, right? And let's imagine that a human bank manager just said, you know what, I'm not going to give home loans to women. People like me would be all over that. Well, yes to me, would be all over that, right? That person would face the full wrath of the regulatory kind of impacts, and no question, right? But if it's an algorithm having that same impact, that the algorithm is having the impact of not granting loans to women at a fair rate, we sometimes question that. We go, well, is that a legal issue, or maybe it's an ethical issue? As a question of law, let me be really clear. It is no less a legal issue. But we've perhaps been lulling people into a false sense of kind of security on the basis that regulators have been too slow to act. And indeed, plaintiff lawyers and the broader regulatory ecosystem has been pretty laissez-faire. Now, that is changing. There's a major case before Australia's Federal Court, Trivago case, which is showing right now in real time that regulators are moving. And you know, the ACCC, the Human Rights Commission, and all of the federal regulators got together several times over about a period of 15 months to, I guess, say, okay, well, how can we make sure that we really are protecting the community against the worst forms of harm? So what that means for an organisation, I think, is you need to first ask, not what are my ethical obligations, what are my legal obligations? Because that is not just a kind of a semantic issue. Your legal obligations are things that you must do. You have no choice about it. Your ethical obligations are different. They're things where you can choose whether you do it or not and how you do it. And so if you start with asking your legal obligations and really lean into that, then I think you're going to be on really safe ground, particularly as the regulatory context is going to be changing very fast over the next 12 to 24 months.
Maybe just to respond quite quickly to Edward, I think a lot of the legal obligations, not just from the sectoral regulatory perspective, may not, I mean, that may be clear, but I think from the AI perspective, it hasn't really been defined yet. I know, for example, in Europe, they're looking at an AI Act where they look at regulating AI and what are the high risk use cases that then needs more attention but I think other legal requirements may not be so clear just yet. From our perspective, the legal requirements, like I said, it's not just from the sectoral agencies or sectoral regulators perspective, it's also on the data side, right, relating to data protection and privacy. But other than that, may not be so clear. And that's why I think when we provide a lot of detailed guidance to companies about responsible AI, we ask that they also take a position on what are their what is their internal code of ethics, for example. What's the position that the organization wants to take? I mean, over and beyond their legal and compliance requirements, right? Because then that sets a direction in terms of how then it wants to implement responsible AI. And in response to Benjamin's question more specifically, right? How do you encourage developers and how do you encourage internal data scientists to do this in a more not to think about implementation in an unbiased way, to think about responsible implementation and so on. I think you have to start from the top, right? I think there's a structured way in which you can take this. One, defining what is your internal organization's position in terms of ethics. What's the code that you want to stand by? Two, setting up the relevant structures internally, for example, a governance board, right? To look at this, making sure that you have the right people in there, maybe the chief technology officer, for example, the people who lead these teams, right? Who understands what are the obligations and requirements that the organization has defined for itself, right? And then, then thinking through these questions internally in that way. And of course, there's also training, building greater awareness and so on within the organization on what are the requirements and obligations. I think there's a structured way in which we can look at this. I can share a link to the guidance document that we published, and I think that could, and that also includes a lot of examples of how other companies have looked at this problem. That could be a way in which some of the audience can draw some inspiration. Yeah, thanks.
Me, why you should do responsible AI? Well, there's two words that should give you a good response to that. Facial recognition. Try now, right now, to implement facial recognition in an organization. I think you're going to have questions coming right, left, and center about why you should not do it, why it's too dangerous, and you're going to have a lot of pushback from the regulators. You've already got that pushback. Like there's last week, effectively, the EU, the Member of Parliament actually requested a ban on facial recognition for when used for police. The Australian Human Rights Commission, in this paper, also one of the recommendations was to have a moratorium for the use of facial recognition that could seriously impact the rights of individuals. So it's going to be, if you don't do AI responsibly or just properly, you are going to suffer. It's going to be very, very hard to implement the tech. And this is just history repeating. I used to work for algo traders for 10 years. When the market crashed, I was just there. And again, we had a substantial pushback on what algorithm traders were doing. We had a ban of their activity. So this knee-jerk reaction is happening very often when you crash the market. So this is why I got in with the standards, because you need best practice to effectively make sure you have a business case in the long run, that you do not just go and implement the tech and just try to do a quick hit, but rather have sustainable business practice that will actually be successful in the long run, and you can have a business model that will not be eaten bit by bit because of the regulatory cost. So that's the let's say what I call the stick approach, but there's also the carrot approach, which effectively is, imagine you with algorithm, you automated decision making. That's the aim. That's what you want, like organization are looking at doing, using algorithm for those purposes, or getting great insights. So if you can do that for, you have to integrate those system in society. To do that well, it needs to benefit people. It need to, and that's why you have that beneficial principle that keeps on coming back through all the AI ethics principle. If you want your algorithm to and the service that you provide to be essential to society, it needs to benefit everyone, and that's when actually it's a true success. It's a corporate success, but it's also a social tool success.
Awesome. So I have two more. So we've been getting a ton of questions from the crowd, and I want to kind of bring some of those in. But before we do that, I really have two more, and I kind of want to bundle them together. So one, how would you recommend going about building predictive model and ML systems that can be trusted and can be transparent? And then the back end of that question is, what do you believe the future of responsible AI looks like? Where do you see us going in the next 1, 3, 5 years?
I'll maybe come in on the first of those questions. I think it follows on very neatly from what Wan Sie, Ed, and Aurelie were all saying. So I think, Ed makes a great point. The law is already pretty clear on discrimination and what is or is not acceptable. The way in which AI is interesting in that context is as it gets more and more sophisticated, it introduces the possibility of doing things that are against the law without you even realizing necessarily, or without it being easy to detect. So let me give you an example of how we've kind of approached this within banking. So let's say there's the law states that we can't discriminate for, a loan decision on the basis of age. And so as we're implementing a machine learning algorithm that decides whether we should provide the loan or not, we don't use age as a variable. But then what you find out is, the model correlates incredibly closely to tenure. So how long have you been at the bank? And it turns out that people who have been at the bank for kind of 40 plus years tend to be older. Surprise, surprise. And that's a very easy link for a human to try and make and say, well, we've introduced unintended bias because the tenure variable skews in a way that is a very good proxy for age, and say, okay, well, we won't introduce that. But as we introduce things like deep learning, where the features that are engineered are so incredibly complex that humans find it very difficult to kind of understand what's going on, we risk potentially introducing these biases without even realizing that we're doing it. And so the two real key kind of things in our arsenal in answer to the question about how would you go about implementing responsible AI, I think two very important tools in your arsenal for any organization or people thinking about this is one, kind of explainability, actual tooling around explainability. What are the drivers of your model at the global and at the local level for individual customers or people? So even if the model is incredibly complicated, at a high level, you're able to understand what are the things that are driving that activity. And the second is, again, programmatic disparity metrication. Again, it doesn't kind of automatically solve things, and it shouldn't. We should have humans looking at those results to check if it meets expectation, et cetera, et cetera. But then it's clear and transparent. Everybody can look at it and make a good informed human judgment, as we have done for kind of many, many decades on any type of technology that gets introduced, I think.
I'm happy to take a swing at your second question, Benjamin, sort of encouraging us to peer into the future. I really like the question because I think we have a bit of a problem of perspective at the moment. We've had the last 20 years, which has been really exciting because AI really for the first time at scale has moved from the laboratory into the real world. And by I know that AI is a difficult term to define, but I'm particularly referring to the kind of combination of machine learning, big data, automation, and massive increases in computing power. So that's exciting because it's allowed data-driven decision-making in a way that we never previously were capable of engaging in. And we look at our capabilities now in terms of making decisions using AI, and they're so much better than what they came, what they replaced, what came before. And that's, in many metrics, true. But what we're not asking is, or we're not asking often enough is, are they as good as they could be? And indeed, are they as good as they need to be? And that's a question that stops us looking backwards, but starts to look forwards. And what we have found is that, there are three big problems, which will force us to, I think, really improve, to stop wishing away some of those problems like algorithmic bias that are holding us back. The first one is that change in kind of regulatory outlook, which I talked about before. The second is community attitudes. Even just over the 3 years that we were surveying the community, primarily in Australia, but in a number of other countries as well, we found that the community was increasingly changing from saying, oh, I'm sort of concerned about privacy, to going, oh no, there's a much more significant concern, which is that I won't be treated fairly on the basis of something I can't control, like my race or my age or my gender, something like that. And that will change behaviour unquestionably. People shop elsewhere if they feel that they won't be treated fairly on that basis. And then the third one is commercial, right? It's model risk. If you make an error that is essentially discriminatory, that's still an error. Like, I care about it primarily because that could lead to a human rights violation. But if you fail to offer the home loan to a woman because she's a woman, you've lost a really good customer. And so in order to continue the trajectory of making better, smarter, more rational, more data-driven decisions, we're really going to have to start wrestling much more with those problems like algorithmic bias.
Maybe I can make an attempt at the second question as well, which is what's coming up in the 1 to 3 years, right, in this area. I think for me, my lens will be very much regulatory governance. I wouldn't talk, about what's happening in the technical aspects of AI. But in terms of regulatory and governance, I think what companies can start to expect is governments are going to be increasingly interested in regulating this area. So we have to start preparing for that. I don't mean by lobbying the governments to say, this is what you should or should not do, but rather start thinking about what you need to do as an organization. There are already lots of hints. I mentioned already the EU's AI Act that defines what they want to do. The US is looking into this area as well. One of the focus very much is on risk assessment. So that's one way in which you can start looking at the different types of risk assessment methodologies that's coming up, and then start deciding, right? Because a lot of these regulations is going to be very much risk-based. Not every single AI system needs to be regulated or governed, or you need to worry about bias in every single system, but there are some that's going to that's going to be more risky to humans. There's higher impact of harm that is somewhat to human, and those are the ones that governments are going to be a little bit more interested in. So it's not just Europe, US, China is doing something. In Singapore, what we are working on is really helping companies be a lot more transparent about their implementation. If you want to, you must be able to explain what your algorithm does or your model does, right? And so what are the ways in which you can do that? So we are working on that mechanism to do that, to help companies actually go about testing and verifying their implementation. So not just explainability, but safety, fairness, and various other attributes of the system. So I think there's something to think about, preparing for a world where not just the regulators, but also society at large will ask for greater responsibility from organizations when they implement AI.
Yeah, on that point, and both the point for Wan Sie and Dan, testing is what you will need to do with the algorithm. So, you know, what's happening with those new technology, and as they converge, you see more and more the convergence together is effectively, and that's kind of exciting for me, is that the risk management that you use and the governance that you use need to be uplifted. Even the project management that the way you project manage normal project versus AI project will be different. So there's need to be a bit of a revamping of those process. And to be honest, that's quite exciting, effectively, because you'll think like, how do you know which risk if the algorithm is changing? So dynamic risk management becomes essential. So that needs to be embedded. You can only do agile with effectively AI. So you need to change your project lifecycle from a compliance perspective. To test for discrimination, you will have say, what test have you run? So that profession is going to, for compliance and the risk management professional, this is actually quite a critical time and a very interesting time. And linking it to what I see coming, well, two things. We're starting the discussion on quantum. So, and Australia is leading on quantum. So quantum AI, right? I don't tell you definitely need new tools to do the testing when it comes to AI that's powered by quantum. And my last piece, what I'll see is what's going to happen with responsible AI? Well, we're going to just drop the responsible. It's just going to be AI, because to be honest, if it's not done responsibly, it will never be used in society. It's not a long-term solution. It's just a quick band-aid.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome point, Aurelie. And yeah, we've talked a lot on this call for understandable reasons about regulatory and legal frameworks and governance, and those things are incredibly important. I think one of the kind of underplayed aspects of responsible AI is that there are applications of AI that allow us to do things that safeguard or help customers or people or communities in ways that weren't previously possible. And so think about, you know, as a large institution, we uncovered a year or so back, it turns out it's happening in a lot of banks, I think, around the world. Unfortunately, the transaction description where you pay somebody for, you know, the coffee, and you say pay bill for coffee, and you type in a little bit of text. It turns out that a small minority, unfortunately, are using that text field to send some horrendous abuse to people, and really some quite awful and shocking examples of people abusing this ability to communicate through micro-payment transactions to reach somebody and be abusive towards them. And so the traditional technology approach that as well, let's, you know, block out swear words or, you know, try and implement filters. It turns out that's ineffective for two reasons. One, apparently a lot of friends jovially swear amongst themselves. I'm not one of those people, but it turns out there are a lot of people who communicate with swear words in a friendly fashion. And the other more important is that it's very easy to kind of get around, so you take a couple of vowels out, stars or whatever it is. And so what we actually found is by implementing a sophisticated AI approach using graph techniques and transfers and other kind of sophisticated things, we're able to get a much better sense of, you know, sorting out the stuff which is kind of jovial banter versus this horrible abuse, and actually able to tackle that. And we're having a material impact now in addressing a problem that we didn't even realize was a problem until, you know, not all that long ago. It's just one example of how AI gives us opportunities to create a better future if it's deployed in the right way at the right kind of problems.
Awesome. So there's a lot to unpack in those answers, but let me actually take a more top of the house question from the audience personally, because you can hear by my accent, I'm more invested in this than others. Where would you put Australian organizations compared to maybe other countries with respect to responsible AI?
Oh, who's going to be brave to come in? I think we'll leave that one to Ed, won't we?
Thanks, Dan. Look, I'm going to sort of approach this from a slightly oblique angle. We had just phenomenal buy-in from companies both in Australia and overseas in our consultation process. I want to acknowledge that. But in the end, we were able to kind of divide companies into three groups. The first were the ones I was most worried about, who took very seriously the Zuckerberg line, just move fast, break things, which is fine if you're developing a computer game or something that's low stakes. But if you're kind of making decisions that affect people's legal or similarly significant rights, to use the GDPR language, that's completely unacceptable. It's probably unlawful a lot of the time, and it's kind of morally bankrupt because essentially you're just kind of running live experiments all the time on your customers. So those fortunately in Australia, there aren't so many of those companies, perhaps a little bit more in North America. Category 2 are the people who look at those kind of really cavalier companies and go, holy crap, we're going to go the other end of the spectrum, and kind of put their head in the sand and say, this whole technology thing is going to blow over and we're going to just be able to use typewriters again sometime soon. And that's not a great solution either. There's probably a few more of those companies in Australia than there should be. I kind of get it. They want to avoid risk. But on the whole, Australia's been a country that has been really kind of innovation forward, and it's a really good test bed with our population and a variety of reasons. So there are a few in those. I think there's a really good Goldilocks kind of group who are the third category, who say, look, we don't have to be first to market. But what we really want to do is understand the tech and really make sure that when we do get out into the real world with whatever our tech solution is, we're going to get it right. And that's the thing that most excites me about Australia, is that there's quite a lot in that third category, and perhaps more proportionally than in some other places around the world as well. And again, if you're operating in a high stakes area, one where if you get it wrong, you can cause real harm, including to people's basic human rights, then you want to be in category 3. You want to make sure that you're proceeding in a way that is really well considered. You've kind of plotted out your process. You've got really good kind of monitoring of the operation of your AI-driven system once it goes out into the real world, and you can adjust when things start perhaps to go in a direction that you don't want them to go. And so that's what gives me most hope.
I think for me, I would mention, I'll take it a bit of a reverse where Australia sits. I have a bit of warning for Australian company, and it's summarized to 2 words: the Brussels effect. If you look at what happened with GDPR, I was working for a Dutch company at the time, and I was looking at the GDPR back in 2016, discussing the impact. Now I was with a group of general counsel, and I was asking everyone back, and that was at 2018, what are you guys thinking about GDPR? And the answer was, GDPR what? So, and the OAIC had put also a small explanation at the time, just before it came into place, companies, beware, this is coming. So, not to repeat history, I think we have the EU AI Act. What's the Brussels effect is the acknowledgement by a Columbia professor that effectively the European Commission is becoming very good at exporting its regulation. The good news is there's a good paper from AI Watch that explain how the regulation that the EU is adopting is looking to be supported by standards. So they actually did a mapping of the standards to each of the requirements of the AI Act. Because the way the EU is looking at regulation now is more to have, rather than the old-fashioned way that they used to have, was to actually build all the technical requirement in the text, which they found doesn't suit, especially if you have to oversee like that number of states that have different laws. So effectively what they're doing now is setting the principle and explaining how the standards are effectively operationalizing those principles. So to that extent, Australia is involved in that work, so it's exciting, but beware of the Brussels effect.
Maybe as somebody, oh, sorry, Dan, you want to go ahead?
No, you go, sure.
No, I was just going to say, as somebody who's not in Australia and from Singapore, I think it's important for us that internationally the rules of the game is consistent, that there's not too much fragmentation in how various jurisdictions decide that they want to regulate AI. And that's why we see Australia as an airline, right? I think a lot of our approach to how we're thinking about responsible AI is very consistent. We have a digital economy agreement with Australia, and that's the sort of like a digital FTA. And AI is one of the components of that. AI governance is one of the components of that, and we work quite closely with our Australian colleagues to think about how do we want to, ensure interoperability of, how we are approaching AI governance and regulations. And I think that's going to be helpful to organizations in both Singapore and Australia. But to the end also, I think just echoing Aurelie, right? As regulations start to come into play, I think what's really important then for companies is to know how that's going to affect them. And for governments, at least from Singapore's perspective, to work together to make sure that the impact to companies are minimized, especially when they want to export to, other regions outside their home country or the domestic market. Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Aurelie and I had similar fun in Europe with GDPR some time ago. Hey, we've talked a lot about bias on this call, so I'm incredibly biased, so you shouldn't believe me on this answer, but I think Australia is doing a fantastic job globally and is, in all seriousness, obviously I've been here for around 4 years in this country. I think one of the things that's really struck me that I think is very much in Australia's favour is the openness and transparency about what's going on in the AI space. I personally spend a huge amount of my time on panels like this or in consultation with academia, industry, peer groups, the government. I think it's really probably the most important thing as we're kind of developing new capabilities, new technologies. We maybe don't know all of the answers at the outset, and the thing that's going to kind of differentiate those who make it, those who don't, are the ones who are kind of most open, transparent, and inclusive about the work that they're doing, bouncing ideas off a diverse group of kind of thinkers, community stakeholders, customers. And I have found, that in Australia, there's an incredible sort of thriving community of like-minded people doing just that, which gives me great hope, I think, for our kind of future as a leader in the application of, to say, not just responsible AI, but just AI.
Awesome. So after this panel, I might have to rethink who's leading the front here. But what I will say is we've got about 5 minutes left, so I want to kind of leave on one specific question. A lot of the questions we've had today have really been talking about kind of post-hoc analysis, debugging, reactive responses to oversight or perceived, coming oversight and regulation. One question which I'm kind of distorting a little bit is, how can people in the data science or data science adjacent space think about building these models, from an upfront perspective in a way that can proactively, push for debiasing to some degree. So I know we're short on time, so I would just ask if you have like one or two concepts that you like to bring into these types of exercises that upfront can kind of help avoid some of the classic pitfalls that you end up seeing in these big fail cases that make headlines globally, really.
I'll go with the first one. So it's a simple one, but it's an important one. I did a workshop where we were with IEEE, where we were looking at using AI to help promote the life of people with mental disability. The workshop was very interesting, and what came out is really to understand how you can understand the context first of where you're deploying the AI system, understanding the history, and having the background, and then actually having the different experts getting to the table and aligning on how this tool is going to improve and to what requirement. So to have that discussion and to have that framework, who is going to benefit how, and have the metrics and define them early on at the very, very beginning, and have the stakeholders involved in there, like all the different stakeholders to the extent you can, is a particularly important conversation for especially for the specific application. If I put this in a day-to-day industry practice, what I see is often it's all on the data scientist. It's the data scientist that to do fairness. That's the data scientist that's got to do to look at responsible AI altogether. This is definitely not a one-man band. So if I have to say one piece of advice would actually to bring again your risk management, your compliance, your designer in that conversation early on, because once you've trained that algorithm, that's going to be very hard to retrain. So just to bring them very early in the conversation to actually make sure you've got your targets, your goals right, and they will serve the purpose that it's meant to serve.
That's great advice, Aurelie. If I can offer one other thing, it's really an attitudinal thing. It's to undersell and therefore, you know, over deliver. I think part of the problem in the wider world is that the term AI is often kind of conceptually replaced with words like magic. And so that means that data scientists who can often do some pretty amazing things kind of set a really, really high bar. And then that can cause all kinds of problems. So I think a lot of the education that happens on AI is done by data scientists. And so I think helping set a realistic understanding of what an algorithmic tool can achieve, I think is really important in making sure that it sort of stays within bounds.
Yeah, hi. So okay, one piece of advice. I actually agree with Aurelie that you shouldn't load everything on the data scientists because it's an organizational accountability. It's not just specific to a team, right? So I think what's really important is to, having said that, what's really important is to look at your data and then decide what are the sensitive attributes, right? Just be very, very specific about it. What are the sensitive attributes that are and that you need to watch out for, right? That are aligned to either your organization's legal and compliance requirements or your corporate values, right? So what's important for your organization? What are your values? And then define the sensitive attributes, and whether it's gender, race, or anything else, right? Age and so on. And then from there, then you can start having the necessary processes to watch out for these, whether it's testing subsequently or looking at a data set, checking for these attributes. And then if these attributes are, if your data set is already sort of, biased, then decide how you want to, if oversample, undersample, for these attributes, or look at creating more synthetic records and things like that. So just start from the beginning, think about, what's important to you as an organization, and then the rest of it hopefully will follow. Yeah.
Yeah, just my advice builds on everybody else's. There's a reason why my title is Chief Decision Scientist, not Chief Data Scientist. One is that it makes my mum proud, which is nice. But the decision word is incredibly important. Nobody acting in isolation. The data science is great. The decisions that you make on the back of it are what really matters. So make sure you have a broad spectrum of diverse viewpoints. Your risk professionals, social scientists, experimentation, people who understand your customers. Don't even start building AI solutions unless you have a kind of coalition of people who are coming at this from a number of different perspectives, is my advice. You're on mute.
Well, yeah, so thank you, everybody. These answers were amazing. I think we got through a lot of heavy stuff today, but I do think this is super, super important, and I know everybody's going to jump. So I do want to leave it here. Obviously, feel free to reach out to us. We are open for questions. We're happy to follow up with materials, with follow-ups. We'll probably be doing some more of these. So stay in touch, get in contact with us, and let us know if we can help on the subject. And thanks, everybody, for your time again. Really appreciate this panel.
Thanks.
Thank you for having me. Had a great time on the panel. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all for the time.
Bye.